I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to speak to Bill C-12, an act respecting certain measures relating to the security of Canada's borders and the integrity of the Canadian immigration system and respecting other related security measures. My name is Hartland Elcock, and I am the Assistant General Counsel and Vice President of the Canadian Bankers Association. With me is Michael Donovan, a member and chair of the CBA's Anti-Money Laundering Specialist Group, and Senior Vice President and Chief AML Officer, Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. We are both pleased to be here today to speak to C-12. The CBA is the voice of more than 60 banks in Canada, employing more than 300,000 Canadians and helping to drive Canada's economic growth and prosperity. Our members take the fight against money laundering, terrorist financing, and sanctions evasion seriously. Among the most active reporting entities in Canada's AML regime, they devote significant resources to their AML programs, including their internal controls and employee training. Much of this investment focuses on continuous improvements to address the shifting landscape of compliance requirements and the evolving nature of risk. Their goal is to effectively detect, deter, and report suspicious activity to mitigate money laundering, terrorist financing, and sanctions evasion. As major stakeholders within the AML regime, our members' participation moves beyond compliance. Banks play a leadership role in public-to-private partnerships with FinTrack. One of these PPPs is Project Guardian, which is focused on identifying transactions or attempted transactions where there are reasonable grounds to suspect money laundering related to fentanyl trafficking. This project led to FinTrack operational alerts and highlight indicators of suspicious transaction for all reporting entities. The CBA and its members also actively participate in ongoing enhancements to Canada's AML regime. For example, the CBA and members have long sat on the Federal Advisory Committee on Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing. We have also been advocates supporting comprehensive beneficial ownership transparency in Canada and increased private-to-private information sharing for AML and ATF purposes. These changes are a step forward for Canada's AML regime. In alignment with our members' position and investment in Canada's AML regime, we suggest targeted changes to Bill C-12, none of which change the substance of the bill, and new regulations to help the bill achieve its policy goals while mitigating adverse outcomes. More specifically, the CBA suggests the following targeted changes to provide clarity to Bill C-12's proposed changes to the regime that will reinforce a risk-based approach, preserve the efficacy of recent enhancements to the AML regime, like private-to-private information sharing, and promote transparency and predictability. These changes are defer the coming into force of increased administrative monetary penalties until regulatory criteria are established to ensure their transparent and predictable application, reserving the highest stamps for egregious and systemic issues. Add a regulation-making power to establish and provide certainty on the criteria for assessing if a compliance program is reasonably designed, risk-based, and effective. Remove the one-year limit to extending a compliance remediation agreement to prevent the arbitrary application of significant additional fines, particularly where a delay is outside the control of a reporting entity. In determining if a client's name is obviously fictitious, rely solely on the judgment of the reporting entity, as this is a highly subjective standard. Exempt banks from the mandatory FinTrack enrollment due to existing oversight. Amend the proposed false information offense to reflect intent to deceive. This is consistent with other similar provisions in the Criminal Code and will avoid triggering the offense when providing information or not in good faith. Clarify that, like a violation, an offense alleged to have been committed before the coming into force of the proposed new provisions in Bill C-12 will not be subject to them. Thank you again. I will now turn to Michael Donovan for final remarks.
Thank you, Hartland. And as Hartland mentioned, my name is Michael Donovan, and I'm very happy to be here in my capacity as the chair of the CBA's Anti-Money Laundering Specialist Group. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak on Bill C-12 today. I want to highlight the commitment of CBA members to an efficient and effective AML regime. CBA members recognize the leadership role they play within Canada's AML regime. They make significant investments in their AML programs and work closely with FinTrack, Finance Canada, law enforcement agencies, and prudential regulators to deter and detect money laundering, terrorist financing, and sanction evasion activities. They also participate actively in discussions and consultations with government to help inform the ongoing evolution of Canada's AML regime. Adopting the technical changes to Bill C-12, as Hartland has outlined today, and in our brief that we presented or provided to the committee, we feel will help ensure a fit-for-purpose, risk-based AML regime that can more effectively target and keep pace with evolving risks. This will strengthen our collective ability to protect the interests of all Canadians. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup pour ces remarques et ce qui nous permet de passer.
Thank you very much for these comments. And we can now start with questions from the members. Mr. Lloyd, 6 minutes. Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci aux témoins. J'espère, Monsieur Alcock, est-ce que vous pourriez peut-être...
The intent to deceive recommendation that you put forward?
Yes, certainly. It up. And again, this is being provided to the committee in a brief, so you should be able to review it there as well. Currently, there's a proposal in the legislation to have an offense, a criminal offense, for failing to provide FINTRAC information or providing incorrect information to FINTRAC. We don't have a problem per se with the offense, but as with many fraudulent offenses under the criminal code, fraudulent statement offenses, there's an intent to deceive. What we wouldn't want here is an unintended consequence where someone in good faith has, through an examination process, let's say with FINTRAC, decided to provide certain information in response to FINTRAC. Perhaps the information, in their view, was correct, or perhaps it was not needed. They failed to provide information because it wasn't simply needed based on their good faith judgment. We wouldn't want a criminal censure to be placed against a good faith action by a compliance officer in an organization. The unintended consequence is you can impact both the hiring and retention of high quality staff in this important area in the bank.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I was wondering, Mr. Donovan, Canada has seen a huge rise in online gambling in recent years due to legislative changes that have really opened up this market. Have you been seeing any related rise in money laundering in relation to online gambling activities?
The scope of what we're here to speak about on Bill C-12 is really looking at the provisions that we've talked about in our opening address and the brief. In terms of seeing an increase in money laundering in the gaming sector, I think that might be a better question directed towards FINTRAC, who receives the information from the gaming sector and other sectors related to suspicion of money laundering coming from those areas, and they would probably be in a better position to answer that question.
So are you saying you can answer the question, or you just won't answer the question?
I don't have the information to be able to accurately tell you whether or not I've seen an increase or not.
Okay,
Again,
I
think it's better to go to FINTRAC for that information.
There was people who were significantly concerned about provisions that I see have now been included in Budget 2025 about banning cash transactions over $10,000. I was wondering if you could provide maybe some context for people about these provisions and why these provisions have been brought forward, and can you provide some more information about those?
I can't speak to Bill C-12 at the moment. Bill C-2. We're here to speak to Bill C-12. I can certainly follow up with your office if that would be helpful and connect you with the CBA. But it would be inappropriate for me to comment on the decision of the government around certain amendments.
How do you think the legislative changes in Bill C-12 will affect law enforcement's ability to investigate complex financial crimes that are related to organized crime?
The majority of changes in Bill C-12 are related to supervision and compliance. That's really the focus of these changes. And, I can't comment necessarily on external factors, but I can indicate, I think, comfortably that the changes we're suggesting, the minor amendments we're suggesting to Bill C-12, would help to create more predictability and transparency around those supervision and compliance powers to ensure a more efficient and effective regime, which ultimately does help to empower the AML
I've only got a minute
regime.
left. Are you familiar with specifically Parts 9 and Parts 10 of Bill C-12? And do you think that these are sufficient to address the current vulnerabilities that criminal organizations are exploiting within the financial sector? Or do you think stronger and clearer legislation is needed?
I think that, we're supportive of a strong AML regime that's efficient and effective. And particularly, we believe if minor amendments are made to Bill C-12 along the lines that we've outlined in the brief to the committee that they'll likely strengthen the regime and lead to better protection for Canadians.
Thank you, MP Lloyd, for that segment. Let me turn to MP Akan for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To be our witnesses today, and my questions will be can be answered by both of you if necessary. So it is evident that the criminals often evolve their methods and techniques to commit illicit financing in Canada. So this includes the use of emerging technologies such as AI-driven bots, the use of platforms like Telegram, or privacy coins to mask some transactions. So can you speak to the effectiveness of the amendments in Bill C-12 to equip Canada's AML regime to catch up and meet the emerging threats?
Again, Bill C-12 is largely focused on supervision and compliance changes within FINTRAC. We believe that should those changes be properly technically amended, as I said, as I said in the outset, all of our amendments that we're suggesting are minor and don't change the substance of the bill. We do believe these will drive efficiencies and effectiveness in the regime, which ultimately flows through to reporting, improved financial intelligence, better prosecutions and investigations, and ultimately protecting Canadians.
You briefly mentioned on your opening remarks that an amendment to C-12, but additional to that, do you see any additional technological or any other collaborative measures that can support that we should consider to strengthen the AML regime?
I'm here today to speak to C-12. So I'm, again, focused on, I think, those technical amendments to the bill that we believe will drive efficiencies and effectiveness, predictability and transparency.
So how does BC-12 strengthen the toolbox of the Canadian government and banking sector to counter money laundering? And can you provide some examples of what illicit financing and money laundering or related activity that C-12 would specifically address?
Bill C-12 predominantly focuses on supervision and compliance. I think that supervision is certainly important. FINTRAC has 35,000 reporting entities, so it's important that they're properly equipped to deal with that supervision. And it's important again that supervision is predictable and transparent, and that this will ultimately drive an effectively functioning supervision regime, will effectively drive improved reporting, and lead to better protection for Canadians.
To what extent can enhanced public-private information sharing, as outlined in Part 10 of Bill C-12, help close the gap between increasingly sophisticated money laundering techniques and Canada's enforcement regime?
Public-to-private information sharing, I believe public-to-private information sharing may not be part of C-12, but I would indicate that we are certainly supportive of responsibly developed information sharing in the AML space. It will create a balance between public safety and certainly the interests of Canadians and their privacy.
How does Canada compare to its closest allies and partners like Five Eyes in terms of anti-money laundering operations and technology? Does C-12 help bring Canada up to speed with these partners? I
can't speak. It would be inappropriate for me to comment on a comparison of the Canadian government's capabilities in comparison to its peers in the Five Eyes network.
Thank you very much. Do I still have time, Mr. Chair?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Wow. Can I share my time with my colleagues?
Of course you can. Madame Danzura?
Absolument.
Ms. Dandurand, thank you very much. So I'm going to continue with that. Please put your earset on. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Generally speaking, to which point the bill, as it is written, will give more power or capacity to financial institutions to track down financial crime? What are going to be the positive impacts in your opinion?
question. Again, I think Bill C-12 as written currently is largely focused on supervision and enforcement. We believe that there should be minor adjustments to those powers, sort of guardrails to create predictability and transparency in their application. Ultimately, this will drive forward, we think, a more efficient and effective AML regime, help to ensure, for example, that we don't have unintended consequences flowing from opaque powers. Some of those unintended consequences could be over-reporting. What we want is the needle in the haystack. I think we've seen this discussed in various different forums before this committee, before our meeting today. And what we'll see, I think, by a properly crafted C-12, again, with very minor amendments that we don't think will change the fundamental nature of the bill, will be a bill that helps to preserve a risk-based approach within the regime, helps to drive efficiency and effectiveness, a fit-for-purpose regime that gets FinTrack the reporting that it needs to generate financial intelligence for law enforcement to then carry out prosecutions and investigations. We're happy to see, or happy to have this discussion today with you.
Merci, Madame la députée. Ce qui m'amène à passer la parole.
Thank you. And now, Ms. Belfort, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So please keep your ears set so you can have the interpretation. You can hear me? Good. So you came here to promote the fight against fraud. And what I remember from what you're saying, you said that a way to fight fraud is identifying fraud. And in fact, who are the actors who are making these frauds? You've been very active in the promotion of anti-fraud fights. So to which extent do you think that the measures in C-12 could maybe, disturb those fraudsters and so improve the safety? I think we should have a few extra seconds. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
We're here today to speak to C-12. The anti-money laundering regime is focused on the reporting of money laundering, sanctions evasion, and anti-terrorist financing. If you would like to speak to the CBA about its involvement in the Canadian Anti-Scam Coalition, we'd be happy to follow up with your office and engage in those discussions.
Est-ce que vous nous avez parlé tantôt dans un de vos amendements de retarder?
In one of your amendments, you talked about delaying the enforcement of penalties and financial sanctions. Could you please clearly explain why would this be one of your recommendations and even an amendment, a proposal for amendment?
As you'll note in the brief that we provided the committee, our intent is not to amend the penalty or the proposed administrative monetary penalties in any way. The idea would be to delay their coming into force until there's clear regulatory criteria around their application. This provides predictability and transparency in their application for all entities, not simply banks, but for all entities under the regime. And through that predictable and transparent application, we can be assured that significant penalties will be used to encourage compliance, particularly where there's egregious or systemic issues. And as you'll note in the brief that we provided the committee in the appendix, we do suggest various different criteria that could be included. This criteria is all focused on the core purpose of AMPS, which is to encourage compliance, including what steps, for example, did an entity take to mitigate some of the challenges or any of the issues that may have encouraged an AMP. What we want and what the AML regime is designed to do is to encourage compliance, and transparency and predictability will help to meet that policy goal.
Quand tout projet de loi qui se fait adopter puis qui obtient la sanction.
So when you have a bill that is adopted and gets royal assent and doesn't come into force immediately, you have to wait for attendant instruments. So what you're saying is that the whole issue of pecuniary sanctions or penalties have to be, we have to have the necessary guardrails to know who's concerned, and if this was not done, if this were not to be done, what would be the consequences or the impact on you?
Yes, To confirm, yes, we do believe that it's important for the AMPS regime to be very clear and transparent before it's brought into force. This flows through the entire bill. I think this has positive benefits for the entire bill, including around what makes a reasonably designed and risk-based effective regime. It's helpful to understand regulatory expectations. It's helpful to understand what potential violations could attract in terms of an AMP. But fundamentally, what the impact could be if we don't have this, a lack of transparency or predictability can create an environment where organizations over-report. You know, on an STR, for example, an institution needs to determine if there's reasonable grounds to suspect money laundering, terrorist financing, or sanctions evasion before they can legally report to FINTRAC. What we don't want is over-reporting. It's key that FINTRAC receives actionable financial intelligence from financial institutions, which it can then analyze, collate into its products for law enforcement. So predictability and transparency in the AMPS regime is important, because what we don't want is an environment of over-reporting, and we believe that if you have an opaque or unclear regime, that may be a potential impact. And so long term, we think it's much healthier for the regime to have those transparent and predictable elements outlined in regulation.
Merci, Madame la députée de Bellefeuille.
Thank you, Madam Chair, to the MP from Bellefeuille. I'll now turn it over to MP Gill for 5 minutes, please.
With MP Motts as well. Thank you to the witnesses for coming here today and testifying. I want to start with my first question. So could you outline the expected financial impacts of Bill C-12 on financial institutes, particularly in light of the bill's significant increase on compliance obligations?
I can't speak to, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on the individual impacts on a member. I don't have line of sight on that level of spend. But what I can say, I think, is, to answer your question, is that the changes that we see, these technical minor changes that don't substantively change the bill, will drive efficiencies and effectiveness, and so will help to ensure that implementation is efficient and effective, which overall means that more resources can be focused on targeting risk and protecting Canadians.
Okay. So given the heightened obligations introduced under Bill C-12, do you foresee a realistic possibility that the increased compliance costs could be passed down to the consumers? For example, I'll give you the higher service fees, reduced service availability, and things like that.
I can't comment. I don't have line of sight on what an individual institution would choose to do. Again, I think our goal is to create the most effective and efficient AML regime to ensure that resources, bank resources, are focused on risk and providing key intelligence to FINTRAC and detecting, deterring.
Can you say anything about, in addition to any costs being passed down to the consumer?
It would be inappropriate for me to comment.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass my time to Glenn Motts.
Thank you very much, Chair. Gentlemen, you mentioned a couple things today that intrigued me a bit. One, you've focused on supervision and compliance, which is the heart of what you're talking about. FINTRAC has 35,000 plus entities that report to them. Now, we know the history of criminals. They seek out exploitation and they don't follow the rules, and they will exploit. They're exploiting the current system, and they will undoubtedly exploit provisions in C-12, right? So there are holes. I was going to call them gaps, but really they're huge holes in the current system where money laundering is a multi-billion-dollar Canadian industry. And so if you had this magic wand and you say, listen, Bill C-12 is a step in the right direction, which we all believe it is, what are some things you can add further that will ensure that the criminals who exploit our current system and will exploit C-12 to its degree will close those holes, close those gaps at least a little bit more? You've proposed some amendments. I think there's still more that can be done. What are your thoughts in the final minute or so that I have to answer that?
Thank you very much. I'd look to our opening remarks. We certainly have worked extensively with the government on changes around enhancing beneficial ownership in Canada, or the transparency of beneficial ownership in Canada. We're also supporters of private-to-private information sharing. As stated earlier, responsible information sharing in the AML space balances the interests of Canadians' privacy with combating.
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute. You speak about compliance, and that's a voluntary act. Criminals will not voluntarily follow the rules. So there's some things extra I think we can do. And from your position, from your vantage point as the banking industry in Canada, there's got to be some more things that could be considered in C12 to prevent, some more exploitation that will occur. And that's really what I'm asking, if I didn't make it clear the first time. So what other things can we really focus on that aren't addressed in your opening remarks or in C12 currently?
Be inappropriate for me to comment, I think, on the government's choices to put forward certain legislation.
You're here as a witness. And the purpose of bringing witnesses to committee is not about government choice. It's about hearing from the experts in the industry. They can help us as whole of government find solutions, because we're all here in the same team saying we need solutions to this problem. And you guys have a unique vantage point to give us those solutions. So it's not about whether it's appropriate or not. You have ideas. You may not have brought them forward today, but pie in the sky, what is it that we need to see and hear and do in C12 that we could still possibly do?
I think, as I said, responsible AML information sharing is a key way to balance the privacy of Canadians with strengthening the AML regime to focus on bad actors. I think investment is also important, which we've seen. We have long advocated as the CBA for investment in prosecutorial and investigative powers. This is important. It's key that organizations within the government, and I think there's been a lot of attempts to do this over decades. This is an issue that the government has long been dealing with. Crime is constantly evolving, so investment is key. And we certainly...
You're saying in law enforcement and prosecution.
Sorry, MB Marcel, that was a very useful segment. With now MB for 5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Merci encore une fois.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Once more, my questions will be in French. So if we're looking at the international stage, we know that it is absolutely necessary to be in tune, especially for our reputation, to be to be in alignment with other jurisdictions on the international scene. So to what extent is this bill going to place us on a level plane, or where does it situate us compared to other jurisdictions when it comes to financial crime?
I think this bill in particular, given its focus on supervision and enforcement, doesn't contain those elements that have been discussed in other forums recently. So again, it's critical for a transparent, effective AML regime to drive forward the transfer of critical financial intelligence to FINTRAC, who can then properly analyze it and then provide it to law enforcement. So, building a regime, as you've done here, or continuing to add to a regime is important, and we think that minor amendments that don't change the substance of the bill are important to ensure that this bill achieves its policy goals of strengthening the AML regime in Canada.
Okay. Dans le projet de loi, ça existe.
In this bill, it is mentioned that compliance programs need to be designed reasonably and based on risks and be efficient. So in what ways does this ensure that the fact that we enshrine this in law, how does it help you to detect the risk of financial crime, and also to detect and deter those evolved strategies rather than just being a facade?
invest heavily in their AML programs. This investment cuts from everything from training of employees to the design of their controls. What's in this bill will, if properly amended, create efficiencies and effectiveness that ensures that the regime functions effectively and provides the information that FinTrack requires to meet its mandate.
I would just add that I think that provision in particular codifies what the banks are already doing, but helps bring a level playing field to other reporting entity sectors across the regime that may not have adopted the same compliance approach. And the technical amendments that we're looking for is just, again, to provide, some assurity and transparency to the criteria to which we'll be measured against in terms of bringing that compliance program that is risk-based and effective to bear. Because right now, the way it's written is still very subjective. And we would just like a little bit more clarity and criteria around what is going to be that test of what's effective. As it's drafted right now, that's a little bit ambiguous to us.
Est-ce que vous avez des recommandations quant aux précisions qu'on devrait avoir à cet égard-là?
Do you have any recommendations with regard to the specifics that we need in order to make this better?
On that point, particularly as it's a regulatory point, as Michael mentioned, our members certainly already have robust, well-funded programs. I think consultation will help to breathe life into the regulations and help to set a standard that benefits the AML regime as a whole. As Michael mentioned, there may be other sectors that would greatly benefit from I think, a clear pathway here. And the banking sector as a leader in this space, through consultation, would certainly be able to provide its views to the government on how best to design these future regulations.
30 secondes, on va dire que c'est terminé.
30 seconds, so might as well say it's over. Well, I'll cede my remaining 30 seconds to MP Bellefeuille. MP Bellefeuille, over to you for 3 minutes. Well, I think there's equally the fact that our witnesses have to listen to me through the interpreters. So thank you very much to my colleague for our generosity. Very often you refer to your statement, and I don't know if you're accustomed to appearing before committees, but the fact that you do not submit your statement in both official languages, nobody around the table read your statement before your appearance. So I'm certain that you have you would have if you had the resources, maybe you'd need to submit those statements in both languages so that we'll be able to look at the proposals you're making. So I'm just saying this. And could you tell me, between today's regime and the one that is proposed under Bill C-12, what is it going to change for the banking system in their day-to-day operations? And citizens on a day-to-day basis who do business with your banks, are they going to be better protected? Can you tell me what's the major difference between the current status quo and C-12 if it gets to be passed?
Thank you, and thank you for the feedback. I would say the major difference with C-12 for our members, to some extent, isn't significant. Our members are highly compliant, have a strong compliance culture, invest heavily in their operations, both from a compliance perspective, but as I said in my opening remarks, from the perspective of engaging directly with FinTrack to drive forward education in the space, to provide all reporting entities with key indicators on reporting on specific types of money laundering and terrorist financing. So banks are leaders in the AML regime. But what we do think is important is amendments to this bill, minor ones, which will help the bill achieve its policy goal of building a stronger compliance and supervision framework for all reporting entities, for those 35,000 reporting entities. For example, mandatory enrollment we support mandatory enrollment in principle. It's important that FinTrack be able to understand who all of its reporting entities are. It needs to know its reporting entity base. In our view, banks shouldn't be included in that program simply because they already have. It's duplicative for banks. Banks are already overseen by OSFI. There's already a registration program in place there. Similarly, banks actually provide assessments to FinTrack to support its compliance operations, as is common in the financial services sector. So FinTrack has a strong relationship and knowledge of all banks operating in Canada, and we don't feel there's a need for banks to provide this registration information. It would simply be duplicative and potentially conflicting between different registration regimes. That does not mean, though, that we do not support mandatory enrollment. Mandatory enrollment, as I said, in principle, is very important for the regime, and it's critical, and this is a critical step forward in C12 for FinTrack to have that information on a broader set of reporting entities, which are 35,000 in number.
Merci, Monsieur Alcock, pour cette brève intervention. Monsieur le député Howe, pour 5
Thank you very much for your intervention.
Thank you for the presentation. Now, I come from Vancouver. You know, I represent the riding of Richmond Centre, Maple. So I'm quite familiar with the so-called Vancouver model of money laundering. And one thing we've identified in the past was that many of these criminal activities or money laundering actually went through the currency exchange operations. And we see that quite often if one operator is being red flagged or sanctioned, then they can easily change the name and then to open up another new operation to carry on with the activities. So from your perspective, is this still going on? And also, is the Bill's C12 are going to do anything about interrupting that kind of chain of operations?
The question, it would be inappropriate, I think, for me to comment on specific risks within the money laundering sector. That's maybe a better question for FinTrack. The CBA, as a trade association, doesn't have line of sight on that level of specificity. What I would say, though, is what's being proposed in Bill C-12 will outline improvements to supervision enforcement, which, as I think Michael mentioned, are important for reporting sectors as a whole. So we will, I think, with the appropriate amendments to C-12 to target it and create transparency and predictability in its application, help to encourage compliance with the PCML TFA for certain reporting sectors, and drive forward a stronger, more efficient money laundering regime which keeps pace with risk. Risks in the AML space are always evolving. That's why our members invest so heavily in their operations, their programs, their policies, their procedures, and their training to ensure they can detect and deter risk as it changes.
So are you saying that the underlying loopholes that enables the Vancouver model remains open, even if Bill C-12 passes? Is that correct?
I don't think that's correct. I simply, it'd be inappropriate for me to comment on that level of specificity. I don't have line of sight on that level of operational information. It, again, is a better question for the government.
What I would just add is that as we look at Bill C-12, I think there's provisions in there that look to help identify individuals involved in the Canadian AML regime from a financial perspective. Those provisions will help identify them so that FinTrack can properly supervise them. There's amendments in here that are asking for greater supervision and assurance that FinTrack is getting information they need in being able to ensure compliance with the AML laws and regulations. And then the requisite penalties for those that are, and with the suggested technical amendments, that those penalties are in place for those who are going to be egregious about not complying with those requirements. And so from all of that perspective, that's why we're very supportive of what's contained here within C12 with the right technical amendments so we don't have the unintended impact. All of that should help to strengthen risks as you're identifying through the typology of the Vancouver model or other money laundering typologies. So the stronger identification, supervision of the players within the market, and an assurance that the information they're providing is accurate and meaningful can only help strengthen the regime.
So I also like to have a discussion on the effectiveness of reporting. So the banks, submit millions of reports to FinTrack every year, yet only a small number led to investigations. And there's been a criticism that the industry is over-reporting on low-value transactions, yet under-reporting on high-risk areas such as, foreign transfers, MSBs, and trade-based laundering. So what is your comment on that?
Some of the criticisms may be over-reporting of data overall, which then makes which can lead to a high volume, low value. Not necessarily that there isn't a high degree of reporting. Our members submit millions of STRs to FinTrack over a multi-year period. So there's certainly a high level of investment in that aspect of the regime. I think, again, what we'd like to see here are the technical amendments that we've suggested that will help drive predictability and transparency in application and help to prevent over-reporting. Clarity in regulatory expectations will assist organizations in meeting those expectations properly and also in analyzing risk and focusing their efforts on pinpointing the needles in the haystack and providing reporting to FinTrack. We've also seen other developments in the regime, such as private-to-private information sharing, enhanced beneficial ownership transparency. All of these, again, help to target risk and to lead to a more effective and efficient AML regime.
Okay, good. From your perspective.
Thank you, MP. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you, Mr. Elcock. Let me turn to MP Sassi for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here and helping us through this legislation. If I could first start off by asking, obviously this legislation is significant, provides us with additional tools, but how do we compare with other Five Eye countries? What is your assessment on that particular front?
Always, as the Canadian regime does, to observe the recommendations of supranational bodies like the Financial Action Task Force. That's how our regime is designed, to tailor those recommendations to the Canadian model. It's done very effectively in Canada. We certainly, as I said, our members invest heavily in their AML operations. Programs.
But overall, since you like to use the term regime constantly, I was just wondering, how do we compare? I appreciate that we're doing our best to keep up with recommendations that are adopted by all of the Five Eyes, but how do we compare? Where are the weaknesses? What are the strengths?
The Canadian regime is always evolving, always learning to address risk more effectively. Again, I know it's repetitive, but I think two really significant steps forward for the regime have been an enhancement to beneficial ownership information and transparency in that with the creation of the Federal Registry. Also, private-to-private information sharing. That was another step forward for the regime really earlier this year. And as we continue to build the regime and better target risk, create a regime that's risk-based, that is purpose-built, that has the tools it needs, like mandatory enrollment, we continue to improve. AML is not a static space. It's a space where risk is constantly evolving.
But we're trying to improve it. As Mr. Motz was saying, we're just trying to determine, where those weaknesses are and how we can improve this legislation. You did touch on the fact that, in your opinion, there weren't sufficient resources devoted to prosecutions. That seems to be a very sensible thing to say. Could you unpack that for all of us so we have a better sense as to what more can be done?
Yeah. I think my statement was that it's always important for investment to exist. So it's important for the regime overall to have the investment and the tools that it needs to carry out its mandate. We've seen, for example, in the FinTrack space, the development of a cost recovery model that is applied to our members and other federally regulated financial institutions. That's a way to ensure the appropriate funding for FinTrack. That continues to expand and may be expanded to other reporting sectors as well.
Reporting is different than prosecutions, is it not?
Yes, I'm speaking to investment more generally.
I'm specifically asking about prosecutions. Since you yourself brought it up, I was just wondering what more can be done to make sure that we strengthen this regime.
Certainly look forward to better understanding the government's proposals around the Federal Financial Crimes Agency or the Financial Crimes Agency, as well as other investments recently outlined.
Okay. Mr. Donovan, is there anything you would like to add to that?
No, I was just, I think in terms of the private-to-private information sharing, we talked about, I know it's not
on the
Bill,
prosecution side.
No, but on Bill C-12,
yeah,
we talked also about public-to-private information sharing coming in the Budget Implementation Act. We also talked, or the budget, we've also talked about the Financial Crime Agency. These are all steps the government is making to, I think, strengthen the AML regime, which will then lead to better investigation and prosecution of money laundering in Canada. And I think that's the commitment that we're seeing through the various pieces of legislation that are coming forward. And we're happy to engage in providing our from a consultative perspective, our input into some of the change in legislation and regulation around that. But those are all the steps that we're seeing can lead to better prosecution of money laundering.
So are you suggesting that prosecution is not a resource issue? It's gaps in the regulatory framework, and once those gaps,
it wouldn't be appropriate for us to speak to the resource gap or not. We're not familiar enough with that side of the justice and prosecution office, but the focus that the government's putting on this area through these various amendments, I think, is a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
Thank you, MP SRC. MPR for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Now, I just want to follow up with my previous questions. So, from your perspective, how effective is the reporting system right now to FinTrack in terms of trying to interrupt these kind of criminal activities and money laundering in the country? So, how effective is the current reporting system, and what kind of changes should be adopted?
It's a reporting system that is constantly evolving and improving. The importance is a regime that increasingly focuses on risk and that encourages targeted reporting to ensure that FinTrack receives the information it needs to enable prosecutions, and protect Canadians, which is what we're all hoping for from the AML regime, and why all stakeholders participate in consultations and invest in the regime. Overall, we think that recent changes, such as private-to-private information sharing, will help to bolster reporting to FinTrack, help to create observation of complex risk and complex criminal activities, and ultimately that improves what goes to FinTrack. So it's an evolution. It's an ongoing iterative process.
Now, I understand that you're representing the banks, right? So you don't want to comment on other money services operations. However, we have to look at the bigger picture. So you're just representing one sector, out of many. So again, if we're looking at the bigger picture, trying to see the continuum of money services business, so where are the loopholes that we haven't addressed since the Vancouver money laundering model has been identified?
I think really today I'm here to speak to Bill C-12, and it would be inappropriate for me to comment more broadly on risk that I don't have a line of sight on. But I can indicate that the changes we're proposing in C-12, again, are minor, and they will ensure that what's outlined in C-12 will help to build a stronger regime and better target risk.
I would just maybe add, though, that the government's recent national risk assessment on money laundering, which the CBA did participate in providing input and feedback on, is probably a good guide to look to where the vulnerabilities are within Canada's AML regime from a money laundering perspective. And I think that, for us, is something that we incorporate within our own institutions, risk assessments that we undertake across the enterprise, as well as when we're looking at our various clients, to help determine the right mitigation controls that we need to put in place to comply with the law, as well as prevent money laundering and terrorist financing here in Canada. And so I think that is the appropriate document to type of look at to see where there may be further opportunities to strengthen Canada's AML regime against the vulnerabilities that have been highlighted in the national risk assessment.
Really disappointed that you failed to comment on the bigger picture, right? You just narrowly define yourself into this very small area. But anyway, so I'm going to ask you another question regarding your the bank that you represent. Now, we know that there are some changes on new money laundering methods linked to the drug trade, such as crypto layering, funnel accounts, and trade manipulation. So again, how is the bank sector adapting to those kinds of new methods of money laundering? So what have you been doing, and what kind of measures that have adopted?
Well, as Mike outlined, the National Risk Assessment has been updated to provide pinpointed information on different types of risks. Banks then invest heavily in their programs, policies, and procedures, and their controls to help target and detect, disrupt, and deter these sorts of activities.
So I would just say it's a continuum. We are always looking to evolve our detection and deterrence methodologies within the various banks to be able to identify these emerging risks and manage those appropriately, and in the end, ensure that we're reporting any suspicion of money laundering related to these emerging technologies or new sectors to FINTRAC, so they can appropriately do their analysis and disclose to law enforcement as required.
So how fast are the banks being able to catch up?
I'm sorry, Mr. MPR. That's all the time we have for that segment. The last segment, and then Madame de Bellefeuille, Monsieur le député Ramsey pour 5 minutes.
Alors, Monsieur, sir, you have 5 minutes. To start, as Ms. Bellefeuille, I want to say that it would have been better if CBA had their brief in 2 languages. It would really have been useful for everyone here. I had the opportunity to meet you before, so I have a bit of information. So in English, you mentioned
certainty on the criteria. Dites-moi donc pourquoi FINTRAC.
Say to me, why is FINTRAC not able to determine those criteria? You are talking about FINTRAC quite a bit in your responses and in your presentation. So I thought that maybe they would be able to produce this kind of regulation, that would, basically fulfill all the requirements.
What we'd like to see is the criteria in regulation rather than in guidance. This creates more transparency, more predictability. It also ensures consultation with reporting entity sectors to ensure that all of the different factors that should be considered, potential unintended consequences, are worked through with government and leads to a robust set of criteria. And it's not uncommon in regulatory or supervision frameworks for specific criteria to be included in regulation.
Capable de faire cette consultation?
And what about this consultation you're talking about? How we do it?
We'd like to see the Department of Finance consult on future regulations, as is common practice under any regulation of the PCN-TFA.
Donc, vous avez parlé de millions de STR.
You spoke of millions of STR, whatever that is. What proportion of these reports is taken by FinTrack and analyzed and then, produced in reports, and we'll have follow-up.
A suspicious transaction report is an STR. These are reports on transactions that there's a reasonable grounds to suspect that there's money laundering, terrorist financing, or sanctions evasion, or an attempted transaction that could be linked to those three offenses. Once that information is passed to FinTrack, it's confidential as to how it's handled and whether it's disclosed to law enforcement and how that's done. So I would encourage engagement with FinTrack and FinTrack's annual report to better understand potential outputs of STRs and how they use that information.
Monsieur Alcock, de parler de high volume.
You spoke about generating a high volume of low quality reporting. So you have your opinion about this, and I understand that FinTrack is the final arbiter on this topic, but in your mind, how could we improve this so that we could generate maybe more STRs that would actually lead to actual outcome, positive outcome?
Of advancements to address this particular point in the last several years. One being private-to-private information sharing. This helps organizations, reporting entities under the PCL-TFA, if properly empowered and approved by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, to share information that will allow them to identify complex criminal networks and improve their ability to determine if there are reasonable grounds to suspect money laundering and terrorist financing, which then allows for an STR to FinTrack. I think more improvements in this area are positive. We've seen public-to-private information sharing also being discussed. I think appropriate AML information sharing that properly balances the privacy of Canadians with their security and safety is an effective way to ensure that financial intelligence STRs are targeted on bad actors, and that FinTrack has actionable information that it can use to empower law enforcement. Also, I'd draw attention to the efforts of our members in this area, public-to-private partnerships. I mentioned Project Guardian, for example, that helps to develop indicators, or that has helped to develop indicators around fentanyl trafficking or money laundering linked to fentanyl trafficking. This isn't only important for our members. This is important for the regime overall. It educates all
Désolé
reporting
de vous
entities.
interrompre, Monsieur Alcock. Je passe la parole à Madame de Bellefeuille pour 2 minutes et demie.
I'll turn over to MP Bellefeuille for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like us to carry on the discussion which we started earlier during the previous round, when you told me that it's important that we know the regulations before, so that we can be able to understand the rules of the game, so to speak. And you said we have to avoid a duplication. Can you give us a few examples of such a duplication and what the consequences could be on our ability to intervene in cases of money laundering? So what is it that we need to avoid in the case of these duplication?
The only area of duplication that we're dealing with, in our view, at least in Bill C-12, is mandatory enrollment. And again, mandatory enrollment is important. It's important that FinTrack know its reporting entity base. But our members already have a strong relationship with FinTrack, are already well known to FinTrack. All of the relevant information is already collected and maintained by OSFI. So it is a duplication to have our members register both with FinTrack and with OSFI. This is the only area where we see a need for a minor technical amendment to avoid duplication. But again, we do not want our comments to be confused with not supporting mandatory enrollment.
Je veux juste vous interrompre, Monsieur le Président, juste pour mieux comprendre. Donc, vous convenez.
I'll interrupt you, please. So you'll agree with me that if we adopt C-12, there'll be this duplication because you seem to be well ahead in terms of compliance. But I mean, my question persists. What does it change for you? What does C12 change for you? You talked about duplication and the fact that we needed to understand the rules of the game. But I think you were consulted by government and you expressed what your constraints were, what concerns were. Do you have the feeling that they listened to you or that they completely disregarded your concern? 20 seconds.
Operates a robust consultative framework. What we're suggesting here are technical changes to the supervision and enforcement proposed amendments in C12. None of our changes seek to undermine the core purpose of the bill or its policy intent. Again, our minor changes, our technical changes to wording, are only to drive forward efficiency and effectiveness. So what we see in C12 is a bill that will enhance supervision and enforcement powers under the regime, or proposes to. We believe those enforcement and supervision enhancements should be predictably and transparently and fairly applied.
Merci, M. Elliott. Désolé de vous interrompre aussi abruptement.
Thank you very much. Sorry for interrupting you. I think we've come to the end of the hour that we had together, and I'd like to thank you both for your presence, for appearing, and for your participation, and for all the preparation. And I'll wish you a good rest of your day.